Yes.
Okay, good morning to all the members of the Working People's Alliance present this morning, and a very good morning to the media and to the persons who are watching live online this press conference of the Working People's Alliance this 9th day of February, 9th day of December, sorry, 2024. I'm your host. I'm the chairman for the panel this morning, and on the WPA's panel, we have co-leaders, Dr. David Hines, Brother Takuma Ogunse, and Brother Rohit Kanai. We also have Professor C.Y. Thomas and Dr. Dennis Canterbury. The order for the conference is that the usual approach. Dr. Hines will read the WPA press statement, and then it will be followed by comments by both Dr. Clive Thomas and Brother Takum Ogunse. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Dr. Hines for him to read the WPA's press release. Dr. Hines. Dr.
Thank you,
Hines,
Brother
have you
Dion.
heard?
Thank you very much, Brother Dion, and good morning to members of the media and the public. WPA is very concerned at the acrimony which is developing around the upcoming national and regional elections. This is not a good sign. First, we are putting our national cohesion at great risk. Our fragile national compact simply cannot withstand another election which is mired in controversy because our major political actors disagree on the rules. This is a sure recipe for prolonged political instability, which, given Guyana's ethno-political divide, could disintegrate into overt conflict. We have been down that road before. A second potential outcome of an acrimonious election is the risk to our economy, which now rests largely on our oil windfall. Economic development in a petro state which is mired in political instability is a non-starter. We have already seen the early signs of how a drift in the direction of autocratic rule is being hastened by our newfound wealth. Controversy over how the oil economy should be managed, how the revenues should be distributed, and what should be our socio-economic priorities will be compounded by a hyper-acrimonious election. At the heart of the problem, there are four major factors. First, we have a government and the ruling party which are resistant to even the faintest hint of bipartisanship and inclusive governance. Second, we have an election body which has succumbed to one-party management due mainly to the independent chairperson advocating our constitutionally mandated nonpartisan responsibility. Third, we have a civil society which has allowed itself to be cowed by government's bullying. Consequently, its voice is smothered and its mouth is muzzled. Fourth, the international community, which became entangled in the controversies of the last election, has confined itself to intermittent statements without overtly offering to play a mediatory role. It is against that background that WPA calls on the president and the leader of the opposition to show some maturity by beginning a dialogue aimed at a political solution regarding the election. Such a solution must include a shared agreement on the rules, the architecture, and a code of conduct for the elections. This is an imperative given what is at stake. It is clear that GCOM finds itself a prisoner of the logic of our political divide. A political solution at the level of the political leaders would release the shackles from GCOM and allow that body to do its job in an impartial manner. Further, such a solution would remove the growing anxiety in the wider populace and restore a sense of confidence in the electoral process. WPA's first preference is for the leaders to take the initiative and begin to meet on their own accord. But given the vastly diametrically opposed positions on the fundamental issues at hand, it may be necessary for some form of mediation. In this regard, WPA suggests a combination of local, regional, and international mediators. The Natural Resource Funds controversy. WPA also notes with much concern the complaint by an opposition-appointed member of the NRF that the committee has become a rubber stamp. This was a response to the government's apparent resistance to itemizing how monies withdrawn from the NRF are utilized. WPA feels that there must be a balance between, on the one hand, the right of the executive to govern without undue coercion, and on the other hand, the constitutional responsibility of the executive to be transparent about and accountable for its fiscal actions. Further, if a high-level confidential investment committee exercising national monitoring and regulatory oversight has an opposition member appointed to it, and that member conveys publicly strong concerns, WPA is duty-bound to call for an equally high-level parliamentary select committee to investigate and report on these publicized concerns in order to ensure natural justice and due process. The cash grant registration. WPS concluded that the ongoing registration process for the cash grant is too cumbersome and consequently has caused much frustration among citizens. As we said at the outset, we do not feel that registration increases transparency and competency. The government has other databases that can be used to distribute the funds. We find it strange that the government has undertaken a registration process for this cash grant, but did not require registration for previous grants. We also note that while the government while the government resists house-to-house registration at GCOM, it is prepared to undertake this cumbersome cash grant registration. In the end, the government has given cash grants to citizens a bad name. Its insistence on political expediency over socio-economic and statutory frameworks has made a mockery of an otherwise laudable policy. In the absence of WPA's initial call for a pilot study and the feasibility study, the government is all over the place on this matter. In light of the above, WPA reiterates its call for a socio-economic audit at the conclusion of this ill-fated exercise. End of statement.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hines, for reading this statement of the Working People's Alliance. I'm now going to ask first Professor Clive Thomas to make some comments, and then he will be followed by Takum Ogunse. Over to you, Professor Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My comments will be very brief. I would like to emphasize at least three important requests we have made of the government so far in this series of press conferences to ensure accountability to the public. First, we call for the due diligence report to be published over car powership. We are still to get a definitive word on that. Second, as the leader just announced, we're calling for an evaluation study based on the recommendations that we have made in regard to the distribution of the cash grant. And thirdly, he has called for a broader search for a political solution, and we would like the authorities to respond to that in a specific way. We cannot do anything more than urge these matters to be brought to the public's attention, but we feel we have a role to play, a necessary role in the governance of the country, and we rest our calls based on that conviction that these questions that we raise should and must be answered. Thank you.
Brother Ogun, thank you, Professor Thomas.
I think all Guyanese would agree that these upcoming elections are decisive and important elections. The last election was fought with a national consciousness that oil have changed the dynamics of the political engagement in the country, and that elections threw up, unfortunately, a situation of profound crisis. And as a nation, we fail to use the opportunity of the crisis to create a reconciliatory environment, even after the government in power concede, allow a change of government, even after the government in power allow a change of government. What we saw from the PPP is a deliberate attempt to use the election crisis and turn it into a greater national crisis. And that crisis lived with us for the last 4 years. And we are approaching the 2025 elections in a worse situation than when we approach the 2020 elections. And the WPA is convinced that as a responsible national party who is engaged in the electoral process, even against our best judgment, sometimes we believe we got to bend back over to try to create the possibility of getting the nation and the major players in the political engagement in the country to stop and to reflect on the situation in the country and to see whether there is not an opportunity for us to move the politics of the country in a different direction, a non-confrontational direction, and one that could enhance national cohesion instead of, worsening the situation. And given the fact that we are now in petroleum producing country, we are in uncharted waters. So the WPA is making this bold call, very conscious that they're going to be cynics who will be out there and trying to, give a certain spin on it, and even the government itself. But we believe that we have an obligation to the people in the country and to use our influence, whatever that may be, to put in the national space constructive solutions to deal with national problems. In relation to the cash transfer, one of the big problems, and this is the view of many people on the ground, I'm reporting the view of many people on the ground. The government has announced, I think, 5 regions where they seems to be committed to make sure that before year end, the registration process and the delivery of the funds is likely to take place. Many persons are saying that they don't know where to go to register. And apparently people are hearing that the registration activities are taking place in X or Y place, mainly due to word of mouth. And there is need for the government to publish, in the national newspaper, on social media, all the places in the various regions and where registration, is being done, and then the time period that citizens could go. You can't, people come and ask you, okay, I live in South Ramfield, where to go to get cash the register. You can't turn them to a document to say, well, look, check the papers, and the government has, display exactly where this activities is being done. Okay, and we believe that that would go a large way in helping to deal with some of the frustrations and the anxiety that people are having on this matter.
Thank you very much.
Brother Chair, before you go to the media, perhaps Brother Rohit Kanai, or one of our co-leaders, may have some preliminary comments. You have to unmute yourself. You have to unmute, Open. Rohit, we're not hearing you.
Thank you, Brother Chair. My brief comment would be that we are struggling to turn the parliament into the sacred voice of the people, which by definition is the role of parliament. We are now treating it as a den of thieves, the way it functions. So we must restore the sacred words of the parliament to represent all of the people and not just one section of the people. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Brother Rohit, for your comments. Now I'm going to ask the media to pose any questions that they may have to any of the panelists, any of the persons who are here on this panel, for them to respond. So it's over to the media. The media, have you heard what I just said? Yeah. Just indicate whether you're hearing me clearly. Yes, Miss Williams, go right ahead.
Good morning. I don't exactly have a question on the press statement. Are you guys taking questions off of the statement though?
Sure.
Okay, I don't know if Dr. Hines or maybe Professor Clive Thomas can speak to this, but over the past few months, we can see there has been a lot of talk surrounding ExxonMobil's seventh project that they have proposed, Hammerhead. And we would have asked the Vice President if there's a possibility that Guyanese would be getting additional fiscal benefits before that permit is approved or given to Exxon. And he would have made the excuse to say that we can't look at that until Exxon would have made their full submissions because he's claiming that there's some information missing. Whilst the other parties, the AFC and the PNC, are of the view that before we basically give Exxon this seventh permit, the government should actually go after better fiscal benefits for Guyanese to see that we can get more from our resources. Can the WPA comment on this?
Professor Thomas, can you take that? You unmute yourself, Prof.
I think the answer is very straightforward. Most people are not aware that we do, in fact, have more than one PSA. We have the original PSA, which we signed with ExxonMobil, and it has been the subject of a lot of analysis and critiques coming mainly from institutions like the IMF, the Inter-American Development Bank, the World Bank, the University of Guyana, many universities around the world. So that has been a long, continuous plea for change and rectification of the original PSA. But we also have a new PSA, which has come out of those criticisms and which is being applied now over the auction of oil blocks that took place about a year, over the last year. And that PSA has not yet yielded a result because nobody has been for any oil blocks definitively and are prepared to go into the production of oil and present any projects to the government so far based on the auction. So that is our new model PSA, which we are trying to bring into effect. There have been reports in the media that Exxon walked away from having to use that new model PSA. I don't know if that's true, but in fact, this is what we should be focusing on as the alternative that we are presenting right now in 2024 to investors coming in to develop our oil resources. So the old PSA is no longer the effective PSA. This new PSA tries to amend from many of the limitations of the old PSA in terms of things like ring fencing, increased payment of local taxes, and so on, because it institutes a local tax, corporate tax, where the government does not pay all the tax for the company, but the company itself pays part of it, pays the tax that is now specified under the model PSA. So that we have two different systems that work. I imagine that we can treat as obsolete the old PSA. And I think going forward, we have to look at the new model PSA. And I would hazard a guess that coming out of this operation that we're undertaking now, over the next year, at the maximum, we get a clear idea if that PSA is going to stimulate foreign investments in oil or not.
If I may add to Professor Thomas's very detailed explanation there, the spirit of your question, we would want to ensure that any future negotiations with Exxon or any oil company, that we should learn from the mistakes of the past engagement. First, the WPA would like any negotiation to be done in a bipartisan manner. Now, the government doesn't have to carry opposition people to the table when it's negotiating with Exxon, but it needs to consult with the political opposition and other stakeholders before any other major undertaking with Exxon. We are very, very, very strong on that. We think that that was one of the weaknesses of the first negotiation. Secondly, we would like some of the issues that were raised about the first negotiation to be ventilated. Given your question, your newspaper seemed to be very concerned about the benefits that Exxon has enjoyed at the expense of our country. We do not ignore that issue. We think that it's a very fair question and that the government needs to be concerned about engaging in any kind of lopsided arrangement. We are also very clear that as a country, a new petrol state, we don't have the kind of leverage that people who are much more experienced and have been longer in the industry. And so we are aware of that limitation. But we think, given what we have, given the volume of oil that we have, given the quality, the sweet oil that we have, we do have some leverage there, and that our government should exercise that leverage. So WPA is not opposed to a much more even negotiation with Exxon that would bring maximum benefits to our country. Given our limitations, but also given the leverage that we have been able to accumulate since First Oil.
Thank you. Secondly, on the issue of cash grants, if we put it in comparison to the amount of years we've been producing oil, and we work it out to, let's say, a daily amount to see how much Ghanaians are getting daily with that $100,000 cash grant, it comes just to about $55. Is the WPA comfortable with the way not just the way that the cash grants are being handed out, but the way of the distribution? Seeing that Ghana is a petrol state, a new petrol state, we've been pumping oil for so long, but all the government could afford to give citizens is basically $55 a day.
Professor Thomas?
We're far from happy with that. We have made an original proposal that it should be $1 million per annum per household. And a household, according to our national statistics, is equivalent to 4.2 persons. So you can do the arithmetic and you'll see how close we are to that. In any case, it's not a static figure. It's a figure that will grow as the output grows and as the opportunities for recouping further revenues arise due to improvements that we might make in the negotiated terms. So that I don't think that's a static figure. As far as we're concerned, the object of the exercise should be clearly, very clearly, and definitively specified. Why we call for an evaluation, because when it's finished, we want to be able to calculate based on what the government says it's trying to do, And it has to say so concretely if we're going to be an evaluation of what the outcomes are. And we hold them to the outcomes that they promised, and we see whether they're able to meet the standards set by that outcome. So if they say that it's supposed to ease poverty, we'd like to get some indication from the evaluation of the extent to which that met, and then supported a claim that it will be a poverty alleviation measure of some significance based on the amount of money that we spend. So once we have clearly defined outcomes, we can do measurements, both quantitative and qualitative, to determine what, in fact, the government has been doing with the money and see if we're spending the money wisely. In all these programs, in any country that is serious about itself, every time a government is involved in spending money, they do some study to evaluate the expenditure against the outcomes that they were expecting. So what we're asking for is a routine, basic thing that you can Google and find in any part of the world, any country, of how the cash grant has affected outcomes declared by the government. And we want to force the government to be able to say specifically what outcome they're intending to have. The difficulty we face is this, that the two variables the government is using, the two variables that are being used are variables that define what a voter is, and not a socio-economic category other than that. And we are concerned that this may just be aimed and spiked at voting considerations. And that is why we want them to give something that we can evaluate these objectives that they have set in terms of quantitative and qualitative socioeconomic analysis.
If I may add to Professor Thomas, we were shocked when we saw the $55 per person. I think it's outrageous. We think that it is outrageous. If you look at our proposal of $1 million per household, 4.2 persons per household, it comes up to about $240,000 per person, not per voter, because a household would include people who are below 18 years old. And so our proposal would have come up to $240,000 to $250,000 per individual if we go at 4.2 persons per household. That is the first thing. The second thing is that $55 per day doesn't help our people mitigate the high cost of living. That's the first thing. Second, it goes nowhere near helping them to alleviate poverty. So if you go by the two things, to help with the cost of living and to alleviate poverty, $55 per day doesn't come near to doing either of the two. And so therefore, we found that the objective of the government is found wanting. It's more a political objective than a socio-economic objective. And we feel cash grants, they may have political spin-offs, but your objective has to always be socio-economic. You are giving cash grants to people to help them to deal with the cost of living in the first instance, and the second instance, to help to alleviate poverty. And you can't do that with a one-off cash grant of $55 per day. It just doesn't cut it. And so WPA finds that the government, as we said, they've given cash grants and cash transfers a bad name. That can hardly be described as a serious cash grant aimed at helping people to deal with poverty and to deal with the high cost of living. WPA, therefore, as Professor Thomas says, look, we are giving the government a chance, because I'm sure when they hear our comments here, they're going to say, how do we know that? Well, we're giving them a chance. Do a socioeconomic audit at the end of the process and tell us how your 100,000 cash grants, which Kaitro News has said comes up to $55 per day, and you are right. do a socioeconomic audit to tell us how your crash grant has helped to mitigate the cost of living and how it has helped to decrease poverty. We give them a chance to do that so that they're not going to say WPA is just talking off the top of its head. We just want to criticize them, right? We think that it doesn't meet those two standards, but we give them a chance to do an audit to tell us whether it meets those two standards.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Hines. Are you? Yes. Go ahead. You finish, Alison?
Yes, I'm finished. That's the last question for me. Thank you.
Okay, all right. Any other question from any other member of the media?
Somebody hand this up, Tiana.
Yes, Tiana, go right ahead.
It's Trina. Good morning. Trina Williams from Ghana Chronicle. I want to ask about Mr. Takuma's commentary on the press statement concerning a non-confrontational approach to politics and national cohesion. My question is, how exactly is the opposition planning to attain national cohesion without a united front? Meaning, we see while WPA is in talks earlier this year, Mr. Norton would have said with the PNC, with rejoining the coalition, we see AFC going in a completely different direction, a separate direction. As opposed to 2020. I want to know how exactly do you guys plan attaining national cohesion and rebuilding the public's trust in the opposition?
Well, Brother Takuma would answer that question, but I just want to say national cohesion doesn't only include the opposition, it includes the government. Our position on national cohesion is not opposition cohesion. It's national cohesion, includes the government. And so we just want to clarify that. But Brother Ogun, you have to unmute, Brother Ogun, unmute.
Okay, I want to embrace your observation because that is central to the thing. National cohesion is not the work of the WPA or simply the work of the opposition. It's the work of all of us in the political space, and particularly the government. Once a government is in office, it has a constitutional, legal, and moral duty to create the political environment, okay, to guarantee national cohesion. And the point we are making is that we came out of the 2020 elections as a very divided nation. And we're taking the position that once the APMU, AFC coalition decide to allow a transfer of governmental power to the PPP, then in any normal political situation, any country that is pursuing democracy, any set of politicians who are conscious and sensitive to the fragile nature of our society with the ethnic challenges would have stepped back, okay, from the hostility that was generated in the period of uncertainty as to what the government would have done. And having the opposition, the government having now become the opposition, which is constitutionally the kind of arrangements that one expects, and the government now becoming the government, constitutional arrangements that we expect that the government will now move to govern for everybody. And one of the first challenges of any serious government was to address the problems that came out of the election crisis as an important national challenge in order to reconcile the country. But instead, the PPP used the crisis to move it from an electoral crisis to a general profound political crisis. They decide that they're not speaking to the opposition. They decide that they are taking away the opposition constitutional right to function as an opposition, taking away the right of half of the country to participate in the governance of the country, and they created a very bad political climate. I will say that they're lucky that the Guyanese opposition is what it is, because in other countries, our opposition would not have taken that the way we took it. These are serious matters. The government is not, the country is not belongs to any party. And when you're in government, you're constitutionally bound to govern for everybody. And one of the critical challenges of any progressive government, regardless of how the government came into being, is to try to reconcile, learn the lessons of the past, and try to create a political atmosphere for national cohesion. And we believe that the PPP government have failed to do that. And I think that the opposition have acted responsible. And to me, and if I was to give a personal, and not a WP, I think WPA believe the opposition act responsible. But if I was to give a personal opinion, I would take a different position. You know, so in these matters, we believe that sometimes we have to call a spade, and we are calling a spade, that we are concerned about going forward to the 2025 elections, given all the known nuances and challenges that we have, that we owe it to the country, to the people of the country, to at least initiate a process or the possibility of discussing a political solution on the elections. We have a question, the political solution on governance, which the press conference is not dealing with this morning.
You've muted yourself, Brother Ogun. Still, I'm not hearing you. We're not hearing you. You've muted.
I tried to unmute just now. Are you hearing me now?
Yes.
Okay, I was making the point that if, as a nation, we agree that we're going forward with the 2025 elections, conscious of what happened in 2020, conscious about the fact that we got a constitutional reform commission that we put in place, and we seem to be totally ignoring it, that then we have a greater responsibility to the nation to ensure that those elections end up being elections that all the stakeholders could accept the outcome of the elections. And we at the WPA believe the way in which things are, if the elections go forward as is, and there is not a political solution on the outstanding problems that are facing these elections, then the country will be in a bad place, to put it lightly.
And if I may add to Brother Ogunse's comments, the PPP has stood in the way of every suggestion for a national compact on matters that are controversial. Just recently, the suggestion that the opposition should have somebody on the procurement board, an area of controversy, immense controversy, the PPP says no. Every time there is a suggestion for a national approach to things, the PPP has said no, that the opposition wants to govern through the back door. Well, the opposition is part of government in a constitutional way. And our constitution calls for inclusive governance. But this government has turned its back on every suggestion of a national approach. On the Venezuelan issue, border issue, it went quarter of the way. It spoke to Mr. Norton and that's it. No more inclusion of the opposition on these matters. So the WPA is saying, with that kind of history over the last 4 years and even before, that taking that into the next election is a recipe for disorder. And we do not want to see our country go down the road of disorder, because it's going to have consequences for our national compact, ethnic consequences, regional consequences, international consequences, consequences for our economy. And so therefore, we are calling on the two leaders, the leader of the opposition representing the opposition parties, and the leader of the PPP and the government to meet and to try to come to a solution, excuse me, a solution that would lead to some kind of sanity in our society, some kind of order in our society as we go in to these elections. Is imperative. At the end of the day, when the parties are finished shadow boxing and doing all they do, we still have a country to develop. We still have 750,000 people who depend on us as political leaders to look after their welfare, to protect them from all kinds of hostilities. And if we take those responsibilities seriously, then we would make sure that when we are reaching the tip, that we pull back. And so what the WPA is proposing here this morning is for us to pull back. Pull back. After all the talk about elections and so on, and who's wrong and who's right, let the leaders sit down and try to hammer out these issues. We would prefer outsiders to stay out, that our two leaders should be matured enough to say, let's sit down and talk. But if they are not able to do it on their own, as a last resort, not first resort, as a last resort, we are proposing that we have a combination of local, regional, and international actors who serve as mediators. But we are very firm that we cannot and ought not to go into the next election in a state of anxiety and disorder, because given what is at stake, we are not sure that we can get out of jail again, meaning that we have gone down this road around elections before. All our elections from 1964 to the present have been shrouded in this kind of controversy. And we're saying at some point we have to say we are tired. We are tired, and do not go into another election in this state. Elections by themselves are not guarantees of democracy, because elections can have outcomes that are undemocratic. They can have outcomes that are detrimental to the society. We would like these elections to have a democratic outcome, to have an outcome that guarantees that our people live together in harmony, And we owe that to our long history of alienation, our long history of dispossession. And now God has blessed us with some resources in which we can bring our people together through a democratic distribution of resources. We ought to be matured politically. So we are calling for political maturity on the part of all the political parties, including the WPA.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Hines and Brother Takuma. Ms. Williams, Trina, have you?
Yes, I have a follow-up there, if I may.
Go ahead.
Okay. I know Mr. Dr. Hines and Mr. Tacoma just mentioned that it's not only the work of the WPA or the opposition for national cohesion, but it's for the government. So I want to go back to 2015 to 2020 on the same question of national cohesion. Would this is for either one of the parties to answer? Would you say that there was national cohesion in that administration, since a lot of opposition members from AFC and so forth have said that they were sidelined by President Granger, and priority was given to PNCR members? Would you say that there was national cohesion?
There's never been national cohesion in Guyana since the split of the national movement in 1953. It has been a challenge for all governments. The PPP government of 57-64, the PNC government of 64-92, the PPP government of 92-2015, the coalition government of 2015-2020, and the present government 2020 to the present. We have never had the optimum of national cohesion. And so therefore, it is not about laying the blame on one government between 2015-2020. It is one of the ailments, one of the failures of our independence, going back to the decolonization period beginning in 1953. It has been a signal failure of our political elites of all political parties, especially two major parties, to bring us to a point of national cohesion. And that is how we would answer that question.
Yes, Ms. Williams, you clear with that?
Yes, I am. Thank you very much.
Okay, then. Thank Good. Yeah. Okay. So, is there any other question from any other member of the media?
Doesn't seem so.
Right. If there are no other questions, I would like to thank the media for joining us today at this press conference. And we look forward to being with you next week. I'm happy that today, the Chronicle, Trina, I'm happy that you were able to ask questions that were more aligned to the discussion today. I mean, it's not hitting at you, but when an editor puts questions in the hands of a journalist, a young journalist like you, who is supposed to be, owning your skills, developing your ability to listen to a press conference, come up with, questions that are germane to the topic and so on. When they just, it's an insult. I've been trained in journalism, and nobody can do me that, but I understand the context in which you work, and it's demeaning. It's really outright, disgusting that this is what our young journalists have to go through, particularly from the PPP as an agent, of government. So I'm hopeful that, you will grow and develop and be able to find yourself in an environment where true independence as a journalist can be where you are, But life in Guyana is like that. It's not that we have to accept it. Thanks for being here, and to all the members of the Working People's Alliance who are on this panel this morning. I want to thank you for being here. To the people who have been watching the conference on Facebook and YouTube, thanks for being with us. Look forward to our next press conference next Monday at the same time on the same channel. Do have a good rest of the day.